My name is Aubrey Sanders. And the morning my family gathered for Easter brunch in Fort Collins, I already knew the room wasn't as harmless as the pastel table settings tried to suggest, because my mother had been circling around a topic she refused to name. I sat down with the quiet certainty that something was about to be taken from me. And before anyone reached for the cinnamon rolls, she lifted her glass and announced that the portion of my grandmother's trust meant for me would be redirected to my younger sister. I watched every face tilt toward me as if waiting for my cooperation. And the only steady thought in my mind was the presence of the woman seated 2 chairs away, who carried the one file capable of dismantling the entire performance. The room hadn't settled after my mother's announcement when she lifted her fork as if nothing unusual had happened. And the relative calm made her add that the family had reached a thoughtful agreement that my grandmother's allocation would support Jenna because I was already established. I felt every gaze slide toward me in that expectant way people use when they want the moment to move past them. And my mother's smile sharpened as she murmured that we should all celebrate a decision rooted in unity. I kept my hands on my napkin and asked when exactly this agreement had happened because I wasn't in the room for any conversation that involved my name. My father leaned back with that steady confidence he used whenever he considered an issue resolved. And he mentioned that I had a solid job in Denver and a predictable path, while Jenna was trying to stabilize her life with limited resources. Someone near the middle of the table exhaled hard enough to rattle a glass, and the sound hung between us as if waiting for someone to claim it. I heard my own voice cut through the murmurs when I asked how a trust with my name on it had quietly become a lifeline for someone else. Jenna shifted beside Aaron with her shoulders tucked close, and my mother stepped into the silence by insisting that family steps up where it's needed and that I understood this better than anyone because I'd always been reliable. The word reliable scraped across my nerves when she added that I should be proud to help my sister launch the next chapter of her life. I didn't raise my voice as I reminded her that pride wasn't the issue and legality was, and that nothing about this conversation resembled consent. A cousin tried to change the subject with a comment about the weather, but the attempt fell flat when my father noted that this was a simple redistribution and that we didn't need to complicate things with technicalities. His refusal to acknowledge the weight of what he'd done pushed a knot of heat up my spine, and the table went still as if everyone sensed the shift. I told him that calling a trust a simple redistribution didn't make it true, especially when the beneficiary hadn't been asked to participate in any decision. My mother straightened as though the posture alone could steady the narrative, and she claimed there was nothing deceptive in wanting fairness between daughters who'd taken different paths. Her attempt at soft reasoning moved across the table like a draft that didn't match the warmth of the room, and even Aaron glanced away as though he didn't want to witness the justification she was building. I answered that fairness couldn't be built on a document with my name quietly erased in a room I wasn't invited into, and the line of her mouth tightened just enough to reveal the pressure she'd hoped no one would notice. The chatter that followed carried the uneasy pitch of people pretending that nothing irreversible had happened, and plates shifted without anyone taking a real bite. My father tried to smooth the moment by urging everyone to enjoy the meal because gatherings like this mattered, but his attempt only magnified how heavily the tension pressed against the table. I told them both that a celebration couldn't be built on a foundation they'd constructed without me, and the air stilled so sharply that even the clatter from the kitchen paused, as if listening for what would come next. I let the quiet settle just long enough to feel its weight before asking my mother who exactly had been part of the discussion she kept referencing, because the only conversations I'd had with her in the past month were about scheduling and casseroles. Her fingers tightened around her napkin as she offered a careful line about household decisions taking shape in different ways, and the phrasing pushed me to lean forward and tell her that decisions involving my name required my presence. A soft clink from someone shifting their plate marked the moment the table realized the script she'd prepared was no longer holding. My father tried to fold the tension by mentioning that unity sometimes demanded uncomfortable choices. But the word unity dragged across the air when I asked him how a trust with my name printed in bold had somehow been reframed as a flexible resource. His jaw set in that familiar way, and he repeated that families adapt based on who needs support. which made Jenna shift again, as though the chair beneath her had suddenly become too small. I kept my voice even when I told him that adaptation wasn't the issue and unauthorized reallocation was, especially when the beneficiary hadn't been notified. My mother stepped in with a polished calm, insisting that everyone at the table understood the spirit behind the decision and that I had always stepped up without being asked. The choice of always pressed into me with the weight of all the times they'd treated my stability as a permanent open tab, and the room grew tighter when I reminded her that predictability didn't equate to disposability. Jenna's eyes flicked toward me when I added that no one had asked her to carry the discomfort of this announcement because that burden had been reserved entirely for me. A relative attempted a low laugh to soften the edges, but it faded when I asked my mother whether she believed silence counted as consent simply because she announced the outcome in a crowded room. Her posture lifted as though she could restore control through height alone, and she answered that I was misunderstanding the intention behind a collective choice meant to strengthen the family. I met her gaze and told her that intention was irrelevant when the process ignored every boundary I'd ever stated. And the hush that followed carried the distinct shift of a narrative beginning to fracture. My mother tried to gather the moment back into her hands with a polished line about how tensions only rose because everyone cared. And the familiar gloss of it pushed me to turn toward the woman seated 2 chairs away and note that clarity might help, especially since she was the only person at the table who'd actually reviewed the trust. A quiet shift moved through the room as heads followed my glance, and Evelyn Porter rested her hand on the slim folder in her lap, while my mother asked why a colleague of mine needed to involve herself in a family matter. I felt the tension sharpen when I answered that this wasn't a colleague, and that the trust my parents were rearranging belonged to someone who had every right to speak for it. Evelyn rose with the calm steadiness she carried into every professional space, and the room's unease thickened when she introduced herself as the managing trustee responsible for administering my grandmother's estate under Colorado law. My father's breath caught at the word trustee, and my mother's posture lost its practiced ease as Evelyn added that her presence today wasn't accidental. The space felt suddenly smaller when she explained that any attempt to redirect a named beneficiary required formal consent. And nothing about this morning reflected any version of that requirement. A murmur rolled across the table as if people weren't sure whether to look at me or at the folder Evelyn placed beside the serving dishes. And my mother asked in a tight voice why an internal process had been brought into a holiday meal. I kept my attention on my mother while telling her that transparency mattered, especially now that the trust's legal representative had heard her describe a decision she didn't have the authority to make. Evelyn met my father's eyes as she noted that accuracy mattered even more, and the silence that followed settled over the table with the unmistakable weight of a story stepping out of their control. Jenna found me on the front walk after the house shifted into the uneasy quiet that follows a story no one can rescue. And the gravel under her shoes gave her away before she murmured that she hadn't known our mother would lay it out like that. The way her arms folded in close made the moment feel smaller than the fight inside. And I told her that knowing the method wasn't the issue when she'd understood the goal long before Evelyn opened the folder. She looked toward the yard as if steady ground lived there and whispered that she never meant to take anything from me, only to stay afloat in a year that had felt impossible. A breeze cut through her breath when I reminded her that impossible years didn't justify opening doors with my name printed on them, especially after watching our parents pretend the trust was a family asset rather than an individual one. Her shoulders rose, dropped, and she admitted that she'd let our mother steer because it felt easier than questioning the plan, even when the plan made her uneasy. I stepped closer and told her that ease wasn't the same as innocence when she'd waited for the announcement with the quiet hope that I wouldn't push back. She blinked hard at the doorway behind us as if trying to understand how quickly the afternoon had turned, and she said she wished I could believe she wasn't my enemy. The wish landed between us with the fragile weight of something partially true, and I told her that I'd never treated her as an enemy, but that I would no longer let myself be treated as a resource waiting for redistribution. She exhaled a shaky breath when I added that the trust existed because our grandmother knew patterns before we did, and neither of us could rewrite the clarity she left behind. By the time I reached my car, The weight of the afternoon had settled into a clarity I hadn't felt in years. And the first thing I did when I got home was open my laptop and draft a direct request to Evelyn's office, instructing them to begin the distribution process exactly as outlined in the trust. The cursor blinked at me with a steadiness that matched my pulse when I added a line noting that all future correspondence should go solely through me. And I pressed send before any familiar hesitation could return. The house felt quieter than usual as the confirmation email arrived, carrying the simple assurance that the next steps were already in motion. My phone lit up the following morning with my mother's number, and her voicemail unfolded in a strained mix of questions and softened reproach before tapering into a long silence when she realized I wasn't calling back. A message came from Jenna later in the afternoon. A tangled apology about pressure she hadn't known how to push against, asking if there was a version of the future where we could talk once the dust settled. I read it twice and set the phone down, knowing that responding before I could trust my own footing would only reopen something I wasn't ready to carry. 2 weeks later, I met with a real estate attorney in Denver who reviewed my grandmother's trust distribution timeline and told me that making an early move on a townhome in the neighborhood I'd been eyeing was not only possible, but practical. The afternoon sun stretched across the conference table as he walked me through the documents, and he paused when I murmured that this was the first major decision in years that felt entirely mine. When I signed the initial papers and closed the folder, the quiet satisfaction that settled into me felt like the final door clicking shut on a story that had run too long in someone else's hands. Thank you for staying with me through this story, because sharing it felt like finally setting something down after carrying it for far too long. If any part of it echoed something in your own life, I hope you'll stay connected here. Your presence means more than you know,